A few months back, I made a video about restoring a set of Weber side draft carburetors for my GTV, including removing and refitting the throttle shafts with new bearings. Since then, I've had quite a few emails and Instagram DMs on that exact topic, throttle shafts. So I thought I should get into it in detail on the channel. So this is a Weber DCOE 27 out of my parts storage. It's pretty much a scrap carburetor body. I've used it to get a couple of spares off of it, but I'm not really planning to use this. But it's a very good carb to show you how to remove a throttle shaft, because the 27s have a brass throttle shaft instead of a steel shaft like later carbs. And these brass ones are really, really tricky. They can bend and break super easily if you don't do this right. I mean, I've got a broken one here that came from a damaged carburetor. But before I get into this, whether you're working on a carb with a steel shaft or a brass shaft, what you always have to remember is you've got to leave these throttle plates installed in the shafts until you have the linkages and the nuts removed. If you take this out and then try and undo one of these nuts, it's going to bend the shaft, especially if it's brass. It's going to bend it immediately. To do this job, you'll need a couple of tools that are pretty simple. You'll need a 1.5mm needle punch, or a pin punch, some people call it that. You'll need a couple of different hammers. There's some like brass to use to cushion your hammer blows on the shaft. And the one thing that's a bit tricky is this little brass tool, which is designed to knock out the bearings from the inside of the carburetor. And I'll get to this at the end of the video and I'll give you the exact specs on this so you can just have one turned up if you need it. So on this carburetor, it's a really good example to show you how to do this, because it is a brass shaft and it's a little bit old and corroded and seized up, so it's not going to be that easy to remove. It's a good one to figure this one out on. I'm going to put this in the vise and then we can get going. So I know I said you'd need a 1.5mm pin punch to knock the split pin out of the shaft. However, I found that the 1.5mm punch was going inside the split pin and not knocking it out. So what I ended up doing was using the back of a broken 2mm drill bit, which worked just fine. So use a 2mm pin punch if you can find one. If you can't find one, use a broken 2mm drill. Works perfectly. That steel ring on the throttle shaft is the cam for the accelerator pump circuit, and it's held in place with that little split pin. Once that pin is removed, you can start knocking the shaft out. However, it's a good idea to start with some heat and some penetrating oil, because no doubt things are going to be tight and they're going to be seized. Now, for this carburetor, I decided to put the 7mm nuts back on the end of the throttle shaft, just to protect the threads when I started knocking it out, even with a little bit more heat and a piece of brass to just cushion the hammer blows. It's very important that you move the shaft from the right to the left so that the accelerator pump cam on the shaft can rest against the side of the chamber where it lives in the carburetor. If you move it from left to right, it will bind and it will bend the shaft. Once the bearing on the left-hand side of the casing was pushed out of the case, it freed up considerably. And then I could knock the shaft out the rest of the way just with a punch. This is where that brass tool comes into play. You slide it into the casing from the left side and use it to knock out the remaining bearing on the right. The shoulder that's machined into it is exactly the right size to press out the bearing on its ID. Now that I have this out of the carburetor body, I'm pretty sure that it's bent or that it's probably a little bit twisted. These brass throttle shafts are so soft, and I think the beading on the one side, I tried not to damage the threads on this side, but I can see that it's taken a bit of a hit. Brass throttle shafts are not something I would recommend putting back into carburetors, because over time they do bend and twist, and you end up with bad synchronization between the two sides of the carburetor. So I would go with steel replacements, which you can just get online. They're pretty easy to get and are a good upgrade to any car running brass shafts. Now, if you've gotten as far in your carburetor rebuild to remove the throttle shaft, you're going to want to replace the bearings. You should be able to get them at any local bearing or seals supplier, and the part number is 6072RS. If they can't get it for you on the part number, give them the dimensions, which are the OD, or the outside diameter, is 19 millimeters, the inside diameter is 7 millimeters, and the width is 6 millimeters. Now, the specs of that brass tool to knock the bearings out from the inside is pretty simple. It's an 8 millimeter shaft that's machined down to 7 millimeters on the end to fit inside the ID of the bearing. And that shoulder, that 7 mil shoulder, is 6 millimeters long, just like the specs of the bearing. And the whole thing is 180 millimeters from end to end. Any machine shop should be able to do it for you in like 2 minutes flat. Refitting the shaft and the new bearings is way easier than getting out. All you need to do is slide the shaft in from either side of the carburetor, making sure that the pump cam is positioned correctly, which is like this, in case you were wondering. Before you tap the split pin back through the cam gear into the shaft, make sure that the holes for the throttle plates are positioned the correct way, which is with the countersunk holes pointing towards the back of the carburetor. Installing the new bearings is pretty easy. I tend to just tap them in with a socket or anything that's really like the right size that's not going to catch on the end of the shafts. And then you can add the retaining springs and covers, and then that's pretty much it. When it comes time to do your throttle plates and your end linkages and nuts, you can tap the shaft side to side to make sure that it's centered exactly the way you want it. But for now, I would call this done. Anyway, I hope this was helpful, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.